Lone Wolf Audioworks presents The New Adventures of Doctor Who. Icebrg, written by David Banks. Read by James Leeper. Chapter 3. Winter 86. That bloody bug was still there. Philip Duval ripped off his thick lens spectacles and rubbed hard at his eyes, trying to get his brain around the neural network he had designed. He stared at the green blur in front of him, the lines of instructions displayed on the VDU. The algorithm was becoming hideously complex. His brain felt swollen inside his skull. He looked around. The open plan office was quiet. Everyone had gone. The lines of desks, each with their computer, merged into the gloom. One or two computers here and there remained alert, chuntering to themselves, sorting data, taking messages, conversing endlessly with other machines over the phone lines. Philip stretched and took his first deep breath of the day. There was a clatter at the far end of the room. He squinted into the darkness. The office cleaner was doing her rounds. It must be late. He closed his eyes, tried to take stock, rubbed his temples where he could feel his thoughts cluttered and clumped in their own neural pathways. The burgeoning program was in his head, as well as the computer in front of him. He had convinced his boss it was worth the company's time and money for him to work for months on this new line of research. And he was definitely getting somewhere. At least he thought he was. He had come cheerily into work, mindless of the winter darkness, an hour before anyone else showed up, knowing he was on the edge of perfecting the basic program, the first ever neuron to be modelled on computer. That had been early this morning. He had worked steadily through the day, hardly noticing the passage of time, or people. There was a sandwich at the corner of his desk. Someone must have left it for him. At lunchtime, to judge by its tired condition, he was suddenly aware of his empty stomach. He grabbed at the food and bit into dry white bread and stringy chicken. Many times during the day he thought he had almost cracked it. A bit of fine-tuning here and there. One or two parameters to tweak, simple matters of readjustment. But no, he wasn't quite there. There was an elusive error in the program. A bug he could not quite trap. He thought of the old computer hacker's adage. Every program has a bug. Paper insect wings, white and elaborate as snowflakes. Flabbed, imagined in some corner of his mind. The ghost in the machine. The flutter of that insubstantial moth. The bug that would remain forever in the system. He munched and swallowed dutifully, stared at the clock on the wall and blinked it into focus. 6:25. Time to call it a day. He must get home, see Jacqueline, find out how the new book was coming on, see something of the little one. Ruby was growing fast, nearly 2 years old. The thought mildly amazed him. Her life was passing him by. His own life was passing him by. Jacqueline's life was passing him by. He made a definite resolve. With Christmas coming up, and Ruby's birthday and Jacqueline's new bit of luck, they ought to make the most of it, grab hold on life, enjoy it while it could still be fun. He would give her a call before he left, just to let her know. He was too often forgetful of these things. He wanted to be a better husband. It was just, well, the truth was that his work was too absorbing. He picked up the phone. jabbed out a familiar pattern on the numeric pad. She was frightened. She could hardly bear to keep watching the TV screen. The world was a bad place. It had bad people in it, and the bad people were going to win. They were horrid flying monkeys, buzzy, buggy flies. Lots and lots of them swarming through the sky, and they were chasing the grown-up girl and her funny friends and her poor little dog, who were running away as fast as they could through the dark, tangly wood. But the wicked witch could see them in her magic mirror, and her horrid monkey bugs were catching up. The witch didn't care about the others, but she wanted the girl alive, and more than anything, she wanted the ruby slippers. Her name was Ruby. The ruby slippers were so important. What was happening on screen was somehow to do with her. Ruby was frightened. On the floor in front of her were scattered the letters of her plastic alphabet, all sorts of bright, happy rainbow colours. She looked down at the funny shapes so that she would not see all the nice funny people being caught by the horrid buggy flies. She knew how to make her name. She looked hard and picked out a B. It was blue. She couldn't help hearing the screams of the girl and her friends. She saw a yellow Y and put it carefully into its place. She could hear the clack of Mummy's typewriter next door. That was a nice sound. She tried to listen to that, and not the screams. Then the screams stopped. Ruby looked up. The TV screen was blank blue, with some white letters on. "Here is news flash," said an important voice. Existence of a 10th planet has long been the subject of speculation by astronomers. Observers at Geneva's snow-capped tracking station in Antarctica have now confirmed. In the next room, Jackie typed. At last she felt she was getting somewhere after so many false starts. All year she had been angling for this commission. Her synopsis had been long and detailed. She knew her idea was good, romantic fiction with hard scientific edge. It could be a blockbuster, but until this week, the publishers had barely nibbled. Then a contract had unexpectedly flopped through the door. She had never had a better Christmas present. She had done it. At last she could write her novel. She did love Philip. She did. But she could not have gone on much longer as she was. Housewife was a double first. Potential PhD, with the dreadful duties of a mother. She had given up too much. But she could not tell Philip that. Besides, she hardly saw him at the moment. Something important he was developing kept him absent from her, even at home. She tried to understand. She knew it couldn't be another woman. She hoped it couldn't. It would be difficult to tell Philip how she really felt. It had been almost as difficult to admit it to herself, that she had a brain and it demanded to be used. For too long, the head had been ruled by the heart. Heart reminded her of Ruby. Jackie looked up and saw her playing gravely with the letter set, her hair a thick black tangle, the tiny brown hands hovering over the coloured bits of plastic. Ruby had been the sweetest thing she could have wished for, though the chance to write the novel came close second at the moment. But being cooped up with a 2-year-old, day after day, even one as intelligent as Ruby, was a kind of death by intellectual strangulation. It demanded the patience of a saint, the ingenuity of a wizard. She had little of either. The novel was a lifeline. Her fingers tappity-tapped over the rickety keys of the old typewriter. Words were clattering out onto the page in front of her, her words framing her thoughts and fantasies. She was aware of a strange, breathless feeling in her chest. She stopped typing for a moment. Then she realized. It was freedom. Happiness. The phone trilled.
Darling? Hello? I'm sorry.
With half an eye, Philip watched his computer's flickering lights, informing him that his day's work was being safely stored. I know it's late, but I'm coming home now.
It's okay. I'm busy, you know.
Philip couldn't help smiling at the pleasure in her voice. How's it going? He asked.
Good. Yes, I think good. Too early to know, of course.
I'll read it and tell you, he suggested, glibly but secretly wondering when he'd get the time.
No. I mean, yes, of course, when it's finished, but not yet.
Her tone was serious and stern.
Promise, Philip. No peeping. Promise?
Yes, I promise. He tried to sound cheated. How's the little one? He glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Ruby squinted out at him.
She's in front of the television and playing with her coloured letters. Don't worry. I have my eye on her.
Jackie, look. It's been a difficult year for us. Let's have a proper Christmas, shall we? He needed courage for this one. You know I love you. He heard a kind of sigh or murmur at the other end. Jackie?
Mm-hmm.
She breathed.
Je t'aime. Come home.
Fuck you, mate! Just fuck you, you fucking wanker! There was no doubting the strength of feeling in the biker. He was angry. The freckled ginger man across the counter had got right up his nose. Alright, he was expecting delivery of something different. The widget, or whatever, was one size up on what they wanted. The firm had got it wrong, again. But he was just a delivery boy, the biker. The ginger man could see that. There was no need to take it out on him. Well, he wasn't taking any more. That was it. He told old Ginger just what he could do with his pissing precious widgets in no uncertain terms. He smashed through the swinging door and strode out onto the lamp-lit street. He pulled on his shiny black helmet. He was working late as it was. He still had a load of calls to make. It was only a poxy temp job anyway, something to keep him afloat until he got his head together. He swung a leather-clad leg over his shiny black machine and kicked down on the starter pedal. The machine purred to life and roared as he twisted the throttle. The powerful engine throbbed between his legs. The machine transferred its power to him. He felt invincible and angry. He pulled down the helmet's shiny visor and became the Faceless biker, his favourite comics hero. He took off into the night, towards his next assignment, shouting a final battle cry. Wanker! Philip handed the money over. The man with the faded face inside the booth gave him the evening paper. It was a ritual both he and the news vendor took for granted. In the light of the passing showroom windows, he made out the picture of a grim-looking iceberg, which covered most of the front page. It was the latest metaphor for a mysterious disease that some believed might become pandemic, a latter-day plague. Those affected now were presented as just the tip of an iceberg. Whatever was lurking in those icy depths was vaster and more murky than could be guessed at present. Philip slowly headed down New Fetter Lane towards the underground station, glancing at the paper as he walked. A headline caught his eye. He brought it close to his heavy spectacles. Wizard of Oz buys peerage. Flamboyant Stanley Straker, the 43-year-old Australian billionaire of who has started to make a name for himself in Britain, is now a lord, and that's official. Owner of several papers, halfway round the world, it appears that Mr. Straker, or the Wizard of Oz, as Fleet Street likes to call him, has for some time wanted to become a pommy pressed baron. Impatient to be graced in the usual time-honoured way, Straker has bought himself, at an as yet undisclosed sum, a peerage for life. He is the first person to avail himself of the government's latest method of raising cash. Huh, Philip snorted and made to cross the road.
Watch it!
A cyclist sped past. Her warning shout was muffled by the filter mask she wore to keep out the traffic fumes. The newspaper flew from Philip's hand, came apart and settled in several places in the empty street. He caught his breath. The street was dark and quiet again. Stupid of me, he thought. Collecting up the pages and putting them in order, he saw another headline. 10th planet sighted. Geneva's International Space Center reports that a new planet has been discovered in the solar system. Now this was really interesting. Philip brought the paper to within inches of his glasses to bring the print into focus. Existence of a 10th planet has long been the subject of speculation by astronomers. Observers at Geneva's snowcap tracking station in Antarctica have now confirmed. Philip read on, absorbed. The faceless biker was making up time. He was still pissed off, but mainly determined to just get the work done and finished for the night. As the Strand became Fleet Street, he overtook a post office van, having to be pretty nifty to avoid an oncoming taxi. Ahead towards St. Paul's, he could see there was a queue of traffic trailing back from the lights.
I don't believe it.
He muttered darkly to himself, inside the darkness of his helmet. This just wasn't his day. Making a lightning calculation of alternative routes, he swung a left down Fetter Lane, narrowly missing a pavement bollard. He was right though. Empty street curving away into New Fetter Lane, and onto Holborn Circus. He opened up the throttle. Leaning over to take the bend at speed, he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road reading a paper.
What the?
He swerved to avoid him, but the stupid geezer trying to get out of the way jumped right into his path. There was a sickening impact, a crunch of bone. It took him all his strength to bring the heavy bike back under his control. He squeezed the brakes and slithered, screeching to a halt. All he could hear was his breath, rasping inside his sweaty helmet. He swallowed hard. His throat was dry. This hasn't happened, he thought. It's all unreal. He slowly turned. He saw the crumbled heap, the spreading black stain inking the surface of the road. All too real. No one had seen. There was no one about. This road was all offices, deserted.
Oh God,
he murmured. He wasn't going to do it, was he?
oh God.
Yes, he was. The bike was already edging forward, away from the untidy heap, almost without his having to think. It wasn't his fault. What could he have done? The bike was picking up speed. As he edged his way onto Holborn Circus and joined the normal hubbub of the evening city traffic, the faceless biker could almost imagine that everything was somehow alright again, that nothing untoward had happened, that in time he could forget. But deep down, he felt an awful dread. He was a marked man. If he was lucky, he might never be found out, get plain away with it. But forget, he knew he wouldn't. Ever. The important man's voice had finished. Ruby was back in the witch's castle. The poor funny people were trapped, and the witch was trying to burn them. It was horrible, but the grown-up girl was picking up a bucket of water, and she threw it over the witch. The witch was melting. Her pointy hat was sinking down into an empty heap of witch's clothes. Some water seeped from under the crumbled heap, and that was all that was left of the witch. The doorbell rang. Her mummy's typing stopped. Ruby didn't care. She was safe now. The witch was dead. Ruby didn't need the nice home noises to comfort her anymore. The witch was dead, melted like ice. That's probably Daddy, Ruby. Silly Daddy, forgotten his key again. Ruby looked down the corridor and saw her mother going to open the front door. Daddy was back. She would tell him. She would tell him about the witch and the grown-up girl and her funny friends. She ran to catch her mother up and hid behind her leg as the big door opened. It wasn't Daddy. It was a woman police constable. Dr. Pam Carter shivered. The flimsy cabin was perched on the edge of Little Falls Lake, high in Minnesota. It wasn't the ideal place to be trying to solve a fiendishly difficult paleomagnetic equation. Miles from anywhere, the area was an icy wilderness, the lake was frozen solid, the wind was howling mercilessly, and a fellow geologist was taking his time in coming through the door. Absently, she put down her pen, still absorbed by the calculations she was making. It seemed to confirm the others. I'll give you a hand, Subi. He was loaded up with heavy canisters of sediment. Thanks, Pamela. These are the last of the batch. She took a couple of the canisters, and together they piled them in the corner. We'll only need these if they want to triple check back in Minnesota. The results are already looking quite conclusive. Yes? Subi was removing his thick gloves and headgear. He started giggling. What? Asked Pam, wanting to share the joke. Her Asian colleague had a bizarre sense of humour. God knows, she needed it in this howling wasteland. What's so funny, Subi? This is serious. But she couldn't help the grin on her face. Forgive me, Pamela. Pea-brained me. Don't pay attention. What? It's just, I was thinking out there of one of your father's figures of speech. They had spent the night before getting drunk in the hotel saloon at Little Falls, 30 miles away. It was the sole pleasure afforded by this kind of field work. She had let herself get maudlin about her difficult relationship with her domineering father. A general in the US Army. He'd always wanted her to be a soldier too, but science was her love, and he distrusted scientists with an intensity which approached the pathological. She had a brother, Terry, who was now a pilot for the ISC. He had thus succeeded in her father's eyes, but she, of course, was merely being stubborn, wanting to be a scientist. She was doing it merely to spite him. There was one positive element to emerge from their constant battles. It made her strong. She had stood up to him and given as good as she got. She had told him that what he wanted from her was impossible for her to give. Impossible is not in my vocabulary, he had retorted. She desperately wanted his love and approval, but at times she hated him. It was a delicious irony that right now they were both in the same position, the scientist and the soldier, each having to tough it out in their separate frozen deserts. His position, of course, was tougher and more important. He was running the snow-capped tracking station for the ISC, man's work, no less. But she knew he knew. She had one up on him, and it was bliss. All this she had offloaded onto poor Subi last night. She'd snitched on all the great man's peccadillos and dissected all his foibles. She had been wicked. Which figure of speech do you mean? He has so many. Well, I'm thinking of what we're finding out here, about the changing magnetic field. It's going to affect everybody, you see. I know that, Subi, and it's not funny. But you know what he'd say if you told him our findings. He put on a grim face and deepened his voice. You're every right to your own opinions, as long as you keep them to yourself. There was a pause. Pam looked puzzled for a moment, then her face cracked open with laughter. They both became hysterical. It was a kind of release. Oh God, Subi, you're right. You're so right, said Pam, when she could catch some breath. They were still laughing hard when they heard a vehicle approach. They weren't expecting anyone. From the window of the hut, they saw it was a mail van. International telegram for Dr. Cutler, shouted the postboy from under his anorak hood as he ran towards the door. She opened it to him and took the proffered envelope, a sudden anxiety clutching at her throat. It was marked official UN dispatch. She tore it open. General Cutler killed in action at STS Geneva Base, Antarctica, 11:20 hours today, 22nd December 86. Stop. Regret further details withheld. In action? Have we got a war down there? Her voice was trembling, incredulous. She blindly turned to Subi. Awkwardly, he tried to grasp her by the shoulders, to comfort her, but she pulled away. Is there a war down there or what? She shouted through the tears. From the porthole of the US military aircraft, Sergeant Dave Hilliard squinted down at the awesome sight 100 feet below. The plane's shadow was moving across the most enormous, most breathtaking structure he had ever seen. It was the shape of an aircraft carrier, only it was bigger. A good 20 times the size, he would guess. Its surface was smooth and flat. To one side, a massive bulkhead towered, its topmost section bulbous and grotesquely fashioned, as if sculptured by an unearthly hand. It was even transporting passengers, or were they crew? Steady lines of penguins like tiny sailors in smart dress uniform thronged the leeward side of the giant Iceberg. It seemed to have momentum all its own, as though propelled. It ploughed through the ice-choked waters, leaving in its wake a gash of rippling blue. Hilliard supposed, with wonder, that the rearing bulkhead caught the wind, acted as a kind of sail. But it was an iceberg. What he saw was but 1/10 its true size. The rest was underwater. The wind alone could move an object of that size. It staggered his imagination. He let out a low whistle and turned to the private sitting next to him. I ain't seen nothing like it. The soldier's face was buried in a comic captioned, "The Faceless Biker rides again," and he was chewing gum. His face still in his comic,
He shouted above the engine noise.
"Hey fellas, Sarge ain't seen nothing like it. He's impressed."
A barrage of whoops and catcalls erupted from the other soldiers.
"First time then, Sarge?"
The old one?
"Sure is,"
He shouted back, good-humouredly.
"and I aim to make the most of it."
He settled back and surveyed the snowy waste over which they flew. The whiteness stretched unending towards the horizon. All this time the soldier next to him had never lifted his head from the comic.
"So, Private, am I to take it you've been assigned Antarctica before?" "No, Sarge,"
came the absorbed reply.
"but I saw this TV thing on it once. Yeah, real neat place."
Sergeant Hilliard gave up and stared out at the horizon. He wondered just what their mission was. A secret clear-up operation was all that he'd been told. Above top secret, his men were all security risk zero. What the hell was that about? The South Pole base they were headed for was UN property. A showcase for multinational cooperation. It should have been clean as a whistle. He had been told that the base was still powered by a small nuclear reactor. Hey, what if it had gone Chernobyl? The Russian reactor had exploded in. When was it? April that year. 80,000 would die of cancer as a result. And that wasn't counting the cattle, the sheep, the reindeer that were radiated. Rudolph was going to have a glowing red nose this Christmas. It was like a plague, this so-called progress, the sergeant mused, this killing ourselves with our own technology. And yet, out there the world looked new and untouched. Yeah, they'd have to play down a nuclear disaster in the Antarctic. It was going to be a long, dirty, boring job after all. The Antarctic snow began to look a little less appealing to him. There was an awful lot of it. What a god-awful way to spend Christmas. He wished he brought a comic. Under the snow and in the depths of the Antarctic ice, in a cavern of flickering lights and whirring machines, a solitary observer impassively monitored an ever-changing pattern of filaments and dials. The patterns assumed a growing intensity. The pulses formed a web of urgent meaning. It was time to act. The observer considered carefully the available information, consulted the historical parallels recorded in the data store, and arrived at a clear conclusion.
Alert, all units, alert. Seek out abandoned landing craft immediate. Removable components to be extracted and retrieved. Mechanimate remains to be examined. Undamaged elements to be recycled. Priority imperative. All units to avoid immediate vicinity of Polar Base. We must remain undetected. We must survive. We must survive.
You have been listening to The New Adventures of Doctor Who Iceberg, written by David Banks. This chapter was read and produced by James Leeper. This has been a Lone Wolf Audioworks production, read for non-profit and for enjoyment purposes only. Be sure to give this video a like, leave a comment, tell me what you think, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next release. This is James Leeper. As always, thanks for listening. Next chapter. Chapter 4. No Time, No Place.